What if the NFL didn't just underestimate Shedeur Sanders, but completely misread him? Because what happened on draft night didn't end the conversation, it ignited one. A quarterback projected by many as a first or second round talent watched team after team pass. Not once, not twice, but over 100 times. And the more he slid, the louder the noise became. Some people celebrated it, others called it disrespect. And suddenly, Shedeur wasn't just a quarterback anymore, he became a debate. That's where things turn strange. If you criticize him, an audience appears. If you defend him, a different audience shows up just as fast. Reasonable takes get buried. Logic gets ignored. And somewhere in the middle, a young quarterback is trying to develop while the entire league argues over what he should be. But then something unexpected happened. A voice the NFL actually listens to stepped in. Not a fan, not a media personality, a future Hall of Famer who knows exactly what a draft slide feels like. And when he spoke about Shedeur, it wasn't hype, it was recognition. At the same time, another respected figure quietly added fuel to the fire, the very coach who passed on him. Now, the quarterback nobody could agree on is walking into a rivalry game that feels heavier than it should, against a team that had a chance to draft him, against a defense that prides itself on breaking young quarterbacks. This isn't just about a game. It's about validation, patience, and what happens when a draft slide turns into motivation. Because if history has taught us anything, it's that players with something to prove can be dangerous. Before the draft slide, before the debates, before the fifth-round shock, Shedeur Sanders had already become something bigger than a quarterback. He became a symbol. For some people, he represented confidence taken too far. For others, he represented everything the league refuses to embrace openly: swagger, self-belief, and a last name that guarantees attention whether he wants it or not. And that's where the split began. There's a strange economy around Shedeur. If you criticize him loudly, an audience forms instantly. If you praise him without question, another crowd shows up just as fast. The extremes are rewarded. Nuance isn't. Being reasonable doesn't trend. And that turned Shedeur into what one commentator bluntly described as a grifter's paradise. Not because of what he did on the field, but because of how people felt about him. Some fans decided they wanted to see him fail before he ever took an NFL snap. Not for football reasons, not for scheme reasons, just vibes. Others decided he could do no wrong, that every criticism was rooted in jealousy or bias. And between those two sides, honest evaluation disappeared. That's dangerous for a young quarterback. Because development doesn't happen in absolutes. Players aren't either busts or saviors. They're projects, progressions, works in motion. But Shedeur never got that grace. Every throw was overanalyzed. Every interview was dissected. Every moment turned into content. Then draft night arrived. And instead of calming things down, it poured gasoline on everything. The slide didn't just shock fans, it validated whichever side people were already on. Critics said, "See, the league knows." Supporters said, "This proves they're biased." Both sides felt confirmed. What got lost was the simplest truth. Teams pass on quarterbacks for 1,000 reasons, and not all of them age well. But once Shedeur fell, the conversation shifted permanently. He wasn't just a rookie anymore. He was a referendum on hype, on confidence, on legacy, on whether being Coach Prime's son helped him or hurt him. And that's the weight he walked into the league carrying. Which is why what happened next, who spoke up, and who stayed quiet, mattered more than anyone realized at the time. When Shedeur Sanders kept falling, the room didn't just get quiet, it got uncomfortable. This wasn't a late-round flyer slipping through the cracks. This was a quarterback many analysts had pegged as a first or second-round talent watching the board move without his name being called. One pick passed, then another, then dozens more. And with every selection, the narrative hardened. By the time he finally came off the board in the fifth round, the shock had already turned into disbelief. Think about what that actually means. 141 players were selected before him, teams with unstable quarterback rooms, teams desperate for long-term answers, teams willing to gamble on upside at the most important position in sports. And still, they passed. Some fans immediately framed it as disrespect. Others framed it as exposure. But the reality is more complicated and more revealing. Draft rooms don't operate on public opinion. They operate on risk tolerance, personality fit, interviews, optics, and long-term control. And somewhere in that process, Shedeur became a question mark rather than a priority. The most talked about moment came at pick 21. The Pittsburgh Steelers were sitting in the perfect spot, a franchise known for patience, stability, development, a team that hadn't truly solved its quarterback future. The speculation was everywhere. Insiders hinted, fans assumed. It felt like the obvious match. And then it didn't happen. Pittsburgh went in a different direction, choosing to reinforce the defense instead. A solid decision on paper, but one that immediately raised eyebrows once Shedeur kept sliding. Because when quarterbacks with upside fall this far, it usually means something scared teams off. And when teams refuse to say what that something is, people start filling in the blanks themselves. That's how narratives are born. By the time Cleveland finally took him, the story wasn't just about value anymore. It was about judgment, about whether the league collectively overthought a player who had already proven he could lead, produce, and handle pressure. And that draft slide didn't just change where Shedeur landed. It changed how every snap he takes is interpreted. Because from that moment on, he wasn't trying to earn a job. He was trying to prove 141 decisions wrong. And not everyone gets that kind of motivation. When Aaron Rodgers talks about quarterbacks, it's different. This isn't a former player chasing relevance or a hot-take artist farming clicks. This is someone who lived through the exact kind of moment Shedeur Sanders just experienced. Someone who knows what it feels like to sit in a green room while expectations collapse in real time. Rodgers didn't forget his own draft night. In 2005, he was projected to go first overall. Instead, he slid all the way to pick 24. Cameras caught every second of it. The waiting, the disbelief, the quiet rage. That moment didn't just shape his career, it fueled it. So when Rodgers mentioned Shedeur's draft slide, it wasn't casual commentary. He pointed out how much longer Shedeur waited, how much more public it was, and how easy it would have been for a young quarterback to let that moment define him. But instead of spiraling, Rodgers noticed something else. Patience. According to Rodgers, Shedeur didn't pout. He didn't check out. He went to work. He stayed steady, focused on developing rather than proving something immediately. And for a quarterback, that response matters more than arm strength or highlight throws. Rodgers also mentioned that Shedeur had been playing pretty well lately. That detail shouldn't be brushed aside. Rodgers is notoriously selective with praise, especially for young quarterbacks. He spent years criticizing sloppy mechanics, rushed decisions, and mental mistakes across the league. For him to publicly acknowledge Shedeur's progress signals something deeper than surface-level respect. It's recognition. And recognition from someone who understands how quickly the league can misjudge talent. Rodgers knows that quarterback development isn't linear, that early struggles don't define ceilings, and that draft position often says more about circumstances than ability. What makes this moment even heavier is timing. Rodgers didn't make these comments in a vacuum. He made them while Shedeur was still being debated, still being doubted, still being measured against expectations he never asked for. And when someone with that resume draws a parallel between his own journey and Shedeur, it forces people to stop and listen. Because if history repeats itself even partially, the league may be watching another draft slide turn into something far more dangerous. What made this situation even more uncomfortable wasn't what Mike Tomlin did. It was what he said after. When Tomlin was asked about Shedeur Sanders, he didn't dodge the question. He didn't downplay him. And he didn't give the usual coach-speak answer meant to say nothing while sounding respectful. Instead, he highlighted traits that NFL teams value more than anything at quarterback: toughness, competitive spirit, the ability to stand in when things get uncomfortable. And then he added the part that changed everything. He said those qualities don't get talked about enough. That's where the tension lives. Because those aren't secondary traits. Those are the traits teams convince themselves they can't teach. Arm talent can be refined, mechanics can be cleaned up, but toughness, competitive edge, that's either there or it is. Tomlin basically admitted it was there, which immediately raises the obvious question: if you saw it, why didn't you act on it? Now, to be fair, this doesn't mean the Steelers made a mistake. Draft decisions are layered, schemes matter, boards fall unpredictably, needs compete with philosophy, and Pittsburgh chose to reinforce its defense, a move that makes sense in isolation. But context matters. Because this is the same franchise still searching for long-term clarity at quarterback, the same franchise known for patience and development, and the same franchise now preparing to face the quarterback they passed on, while publicly praising the very traits that separate survivors from washouts at the position. That contradiction is hard to ignore. What Tomlin did, intentionally or not, was validate the part of Shedeur's profile that critics dismissed. The narrative had always been about hype, legacy, and noise. Tomlin redirected the conversation to something far less flashy: resilience. And when that comes from one of the most respected coaches in football, it changes how people hear it. Because now the discussion isn't just about draft position anymore. It's about evaluation. About whether teams let narratives, interviews, or optics cloud what was already visible on tape, and whether the league once again outsmarted itself at the most important position in the game. That's why this moment stuck. Not because Tomlin praised Shedeur, but because he praised exactly what teams claim they're always looking for after choosing not to draft him. Here's the part that doesn't get talked about enough. When teams passed on Shedeur Sanders, they didn't just pass on a player, they passed on value. Real, measurable value that front offices spend years trying to manufacture. Quarterbacks taken in the first round come with massive expectations and massive price tags, guaranteed money, fifth-year options, pressure to start early whether they're ready or not. Miss on that pick, and it can set a franchise back half a decade. Shedeur didn't come with any of that baggage. Cleveland got him in the 5th round. That means a smaller contract, less financial risk, and more flexibility. If he develops into a legitimate starter, it's one of the biggest bargains in the league. If he doesn't, the damage is minimal. That's the kind of asymmetric bet teams love, except most of them refuse to take it. And that's where hindsight starts creeping in. Teams that needed quarterbacks passed anyway. Some went with safer profiles. Others chose to kick the can down the road. A few invested premium picks in situations that were arguably worse. At the time, those decisions were defended as cautious, calculated, and responsible. Now they're being re-examined. Because while those teams paid top dollar for uncertainty, Cleveland bought patience at a discount. Shedeur was never forced into the lineup as a savior. He wasn't crowned the future on day one. He was allowed to develop quietly, or at least as quietly as possible for someone with his last name. That difference matters. It gives the Browns leverage, time, options. They can evaluate him honestly without being trapped by sunk cost. And in a league where quarterback panic drives most bad decisions, that restraint is powerful. Of course, none of this guarantees success. Draft slides happen for reasons. Teams have concerns. Interviews matter, fit matters, and sometimes the league gets it right. But when a player with production, toughness, and visible growth falls this far, the math changes. Now the risk is Cleveland. It's everyone else. Because if Shedeur continues to progress, even modestly, the conversation flips fast. What looked like caution starts looking like fear. What felt logical starts looking like overthinking. And suddenly, the fifth-round quarterback isn't the question anymore. The league's decision-making is. Here, where the story takes a turn most people aren't comfortable with. Despite drafting Shedeur Sanders and watching him show flashes under difficult circumstances, reports suggest the Browns are still keeping their eyes on future quarterback classes. Not as an indictment, not as a slight, but as insurance. And that's where people get it wrong. This isn't Cleveland doubting Shedeur. This is Cleveland protecting itself. Quarterback evaluation is the most unforgiving job in sports. Teams don't get extra points for loyalty, and they don't get refunds for optimism. So instead of declaring Shedeur the future, or rushing him into a role he wasn't supposed to have this early, the Browns are doing something rare. They're staying flexible. From a front office perspective, it's almost perfect. Shedeur develops without the weight of being the guy. The team gathers real NFL tape, not projections. And if he proves he can handle the job, Cleveland wins big, a potential franchise quarterback on a fifth-round contract. If he does, they still have options. That's not disrespect, that's leverage. And it's exactly why this situation is so dangerous for the rest of the league, because the Browns aren't boxed in by draft position or public pressure. They don't need to force a narrative. They can let performance decide everything. What makes this even more interesting is timing. Shedeur was never supposed to be thrown into chaos, yet here he is, playing behind an inconsistent line with limited weapons and a season already drifting off course. And instead of collapsing, he's competing, making mistakes, yes, but also showing resilience, mobility, poise that doesn't match his draft slot. Those are things you can't fake. So when people say Cleveland is already looking past him, they're missing the bigger picture. The Browns aren't looking past Shedeur. They're watching him closely. Because if he keeps improving, this hedge turns into a masterstroke. The Browns gain stability, value, and time, three things most teams never have at quarterback. And if that happens, the draft slide won't just look like a miss. It'll look like the moment Cleveland quietly outplayed the rest of the league. This is where the story stops being theoretical. Because now, Shedeur Sanders isn't just developing in practice or showing flashes on tape. He's walking straight into a moment the NFL loves to pretend doesn't matter, but always does. Facing the Pittsburgh Steelers. On paper, it's just another divisional game, but emotionally, it's loaded. This is the team that had a clean shot at him. Pick 21. No chaos. No trade gymnastics. A stable organization with a history of developing quarterbacks. And they passed. Now they have to prepare for him. And even if no one says it out loud, that changes the energy. Steelers' defenses don't just test quarterbacks physically, they test confidence. They disguise pressure. They force quick decisions. They punish hesitation. For a young quarterback, especially one still earning trust, it's one of the toughest environments you can walk into. And that's what makes this fascinating. Because Shedeur isn't coming in as a savior. He isn't being protected by expectations. He's coming in as a fifth-round pick with nothing promised and nothing to lose. That's a dangerous place to operate from. There's also the rivalry factor. Browns versus Steelers games don't need extra motivation. They're messy, they're emotional, and they have a way of turning unknown players into villains or heroes overnight. Add the layer of the quarterback we passed on, and the stakes rise without anyone ever acknowledging them publicly. Even Mike Tomlin's comments linger here. Toughness, competitive spirit, traits he praised, traits now standing across from his defense. Whether intentional or not, this becomes a silent evaluation in real time. And that's the truth about moments like this. They don't decide careers in one game, but they shape narratives fast. A calm performance changes conversations. A resilient response under pressure earns respect even in a loss. And a breakout, that flips everything. This game doesn't need revenge to matter. All it needs is opportunity. Because when a quarterback with a chip on his shoulder steps into an environment built to break young players, the outcome says more than any draft grade ever could. And for Shedeur Sanders, this is the kind of night that turns doubt into belief, or belief into something louder. Either way, the league will be watching. This is how narratives flip in the NFL. Not with apologies, not with explanations, but with time, pressure, and opportunity colliding at the same moment. Shedeur Sanders didn't ask to become a debate. He didn't ask to slide, and he definitely didn't ask to be judged through extremes instead of context. But that's exactly what happened. Now, the league is in an uncomfortable spot. A future Hall of Famer has publicly recognized his patience and growth. One of the most respected coaches in football has praised the very traits teams claim they prioritize: toughness and competitive spirit. And the Browns are sitting on a fifth-round quarterback who's showing resilience in a situation most rookies would crumble under. That combination doesn't happen often. Draft slides have a strange way of aging. What looks logical in April can look reckless by November, and what feels like caution can quietly turn into regret. The NFL has seen this movie before. Quarterbacks fall, chips form, careers get shaped by being told no too many times. Aaron Rodgers lived it, and now he's watching Shedeur walk a similar path. This Steelers game won't define Shedeur's career, but it will define how people talk about him next, because moments under pressure tend to reveal what development charts can't: calm, poise, response, growth. And if Shedeur continues to show those traits, the conversation shifts again. Suddenly, the fifth-round label stops mattering, the noise fades, and the draft slide becomes the origin story instead of the punchline. That's the danger of letting narratives override evaluation. Because sometimes, the player everyone argued about turns out to be the one who lasts the longest. And when that happens, the league doesn't get a do-over. It just gets a reminder: